The dusty stagecoach lurched to a halt outside the boarding house in Unionville, Nevada, and Louise Nichols stepped down onto the wooden platform with trembling legs, knowing that everything she had ever loved lay buried 300 miles behind her. The August heat of 1878 pressed against her black mourning dress like a physical weight, and the silver locket around her neck felt heavier than iron. Inside were two tiny portraits, her husband Thomas and their stillborn daughter, both taken from her within the same terrible week 6 months ago. The doctor's words still echoed in her mind during the long nights when sleep refused to come. The complications from the birth had left her unable to ever conceive again. She was 24 years old, a widow and barren. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Louise had come to Nevada with nothing but a single trunk and a letter from her late husband's cousin, offering her work as a schoolteacher in Unionville. The silver mining town nestled in the Humboldt Range had seen better days, but it still had children who needed education and a community that apparently needed another woman's presence. She clutched her carpetbag tighter and looked down the main street, watching miners and cowboys move about their business under the relentless sun. "Miss Nichols," a woman's voice called from the boarding house doorway. "I'm Mrs. Patterson. We've been expecting you." The boarding house was clean but sparse, much like everything else Louise had seen so far. Mrs. Patterson was a robust woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands that had clearly seen decades of hard work. She showed Louise to a small room on the second floor with a window overlooking the street. "The school's just down the way," Mrs. Patterson explained, setting down a pitcher of water. "Mr. Thompson, he's the one who usually teaches, but his lungs got bad from working in the mines before he took up teaching. He needs help with the younger children. You'll meet him tomorrow." Louise nodded, unpacking her few belongings with mechanical precision. She had become good at moving through life without really feeling it, at doing what needed to be done while keeping her heart locked away where it could not be hurt again. That evening, she ate a simple supper in the boarding house dining room with the other residents. A bank clerk, 2 miners, and an older gentleman who worked at the assay office. They were polite but curious, asking careful questions about where she came from and what brought her to Unionville. Louise gave them the basic facts without the painful details. She was a widow. She needed work. She could teach. That was all they needed to know. After supper, she walked down the street as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple. The town was small, perhaps 300 people at most, with the typical establishments of any mining town. Saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, a church, and various other businesses that served the needs of men who dug silver from the earth and spent their wages just as quickly. She found the schoolhouse easily enough. It was a simple wooden structure with a bell tower and a small yard where children could play. Through the windows, she could see desks arranged in neat rows and a blackboard at the front. This would be her purpose now, she told herself. These children would be her focus. She would pour what was left of her heart into teaching them, and perhaps that would be enough to make a life worth living. The next morning, Louise met Mr. Thompson, a thin man in his 40s who coughed frequently into a handkerchief. He was grateful for her help and showed her around the schoolhouse with genuine enthusiasm despite his obvious illness. "We have about 30 children," he explained, his voice raspy. "Ages 6 to 14, though some of the older boys only come in winter when mining work is scarce. I'll handle the older students and mathematics while you work with the younger ones on reading and writing." "Does that suit you?" "Perfectly," Louise replied and meant it. The younger children would be easier on her heart. She could teach them without constantly imagining her own daughter growing to that age, learning to read, learning to write, learning all the things that would never be. The children arrived shortly after 8 o'clock, a noisy tumble of energy and curiosity. They stared at Louise with open interest, these sons and daughters of miners and shopkeepers and ranchers. She smiled at them, a real smile that surprised her with its genuine warmth, and introduced herself as Miss Nichols. The morning passed quickly, as she worked with the youngest students on their letters. There was 7-year-old Timothy, who could not sit still, 6-year-old Sarah with her serious eyes and careful hand, 8-year-old brothers James and John, who competed at everything, and a dozen others who quickly began to work their way into her carefully guarded heart despite her best efforts. During the lunch hour, when the children scattered outside to eat and play, Mr. Thompson joined her at her desk. "You're a natural," he said kindly. "The little ones have taken to you already." "They're good children," Louise replied, watching them through the window. "Most of them are ranch children," Mr. Thompson continued. "The mining families tend to move on when the work dries up, but the ranchers are here to stay. That's the future of this valley, I think. The silver will run out eventually, but the land will always be here." Louise nodded, only half listening. Her attention had been caught by a tall man on horseback who had stopped outside the schoolhouse. He dismounted with easy grace and stood talking to some of the older boys, his hat shading his face from the sun. There was something about the way he moved that spoke of quiet strength and confidence without arrogance. "That's Quinton Tanner," Mr. Thompson said, following her gaze. "Owns the largest ranch in the valley, about 10 miles north of town. Good man. Lost his wife to cholera 3 years back. He brings his nephew to school when he's in town for supplies." Louise watched as the man crouched down to talk to a boy of about 10, his hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. The gesture was so tender, so paternal, that she felt her throat tighten. She turned away from the window and focused on organizing her teaching materials for the afternoon lessons. But she found herself thinking about Quinton Tanner throughout the rest of the day. There had been something in that brief glimpse that intrigued her despite her determination to keep her heart locked away. Perhaps it was simply that she recognized a fellow sufferer, someone else who had loved and lost, and was trying to build a life from the ruins. 3 weeks passed in a comfortable routine. Louise threw herself into teaching with a dedication that impressed even Mr. Thompson. She prepared lessons in the evenings, helped the children individually during the day, and slowly began to feel like a real part of Unionville. Mrs. Patterson invited her to church socials. Some of the other women in town included her in their sewing circles. She was beginning to belong somewhere again, even if the deepest part of her heart remained locked and frozen. She saw Quinton Tanner several more times during those weeks. He came to town every Saturday for supplies and always stopped by the schoolhouse to check on his nephew, a quiet boy named Daniel who was bright but painfully shy. Louise found herself watching for him without quite meaning to, noticing details about him that she told herself did not matter. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that looked gray in some lights and blue in others. His face was weathered from years in the sun but not harsh. Instead, it held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his strong frame and capable hands. He always spoke softly to the children, always listened when they talked to him, and always had a kind word for Mr. Thompson and herself when their paths crossed. "Good morning, Miss Nichols," he would say, touching the brim of his hat. "I hope the children are behaving themselves." "They're wonderful," she would reply, and that would be the extent of their conversation. But something about those brief exchanges stayed with her longer than she wanted to admit. It was early September when everything changed. The afternoon had grown late, and most of the children had already been collected by their parents or had walked home in groups. Only young Daniel Tanner remained, sitting on the schoolhouse steps and looking worried. "Your uncle is usually very prompt," Louise said gently, sitting beside the boy. "I'm sure he'll be here soon." "What if something happened?" Daniel asked, his voice small. "What if one of the horses got hurt? Or what if Uncle Quinton is sick?" "I'm certain everything is fine," Louise assured him, though she was beginning to wonder herself. It was not like Quinton to be late. In the 6 weeks she had known him, he had always been exactly on time, every single Saturday without fail. Another hour passed. The sun began to sink toward the mountains. Mr. Thompson had already gone home, his coughing worse than usual. Louise made Daniel eat the extra biscuit she had brought for lunch and tried to keep the worry from her own face. Finally, she saw a wagon approaching, but it was not Quinton driving. Instead, one of his ranch hands pulled up in front of the schoolhouse, looking apologetic and tired. "Sorry, Miss Nichols," the man said, climbing down from the wagon seat. "Mr. Tanner sent me to fetch Daniel. We had some trouble out at the ranch today. One of the hands got thrown from his horse and broke his leg pretty bad. Mr. Tanner's been dealing with that all afternoon." "Is the man going to be all right?" Louise asked. "Doc says he'll heal, but it'll take time. Mr. Tanner feels terrible about being late. He asked me to apologize to you for making you wait." Louise helped Daniel into the wagon and watched them drive away, feeling oddly deflated. She walked back to the boarding house slowly, wondering why she cared so much about a man she barely knew. The next Saturday, Quinton came himself. He arrived at the usual time and immediately sought out Louise, his hat in his hands and genuine distress on his face. "Miss Nichols, I cannot apologize enough for last week," he said. "I know I left you waiting with Daniel for hours. That was inexcusable." "It was completely understandable," Louise replied. "Your hand needed help. Daniel was fine. Please do not trouble yourself about it." Still, it was not right. He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture that was almost nervous. "I was wondering if you might allow me to make it up to you. Would you consider joining Daniel and me for supper this evening? Nothing fancy, just a meal at the hotel restaurant." "I know it's presumptuous to ask, but I would feel better if I could at least offer you a proper apology over a decent meal." Louise hesitated. She had not shared a meal alone with a man since Thomas died. But there was something so earnest in Quinton's face, so genuinely concerned that he had caused her inconvenience, that she found herself agreeing before she quite meant to. "That would be lovely," she said. "Thank you." His smile transformed his whole face, lighting up his eyes and softening the weathered lines around them. 6 o'clock. I'll come by the boarding house to collect you." Louise spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation that surprised her. She told herself it was just a meal, just a polite gesture from a grateful guardian to his nephew's teacher. It meant nothing more than that. But she still found herself taking extra care with her appearance that evening, changing from her practical day dress into her better dark blue one, and arranging her hair with more attention than she had given it in months. Quinton arrived exactly at 6, freshly shaved and dressed in clean clothes that showed he had taken similar care with his own appearance. He offered her his arm, and they walked the short distance to the hotel with Daniel running ahead of them, his earlier shyness forgotten in his excitement about eating at a restaurant. The meal was simple but good: roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. But it was the conversation that Louise found herself enjoying most. Quinton was an easy man to talk to, asking thoughtful questions and listening to her answers with genuine interest. He wanted to know about her teaching methods, about the books she liked to read, about her opinions on everything from politics to poetry. He told her about his ranch, about the challenges of raising cattle in the Nevada high desert, about his plans to expand his herd and improve his breeding stock. He talked about Daniel, who was his late wife's nephew and had come to live with him after both the boy's parents died of influenza 2 years ago. "He's a good boy," Quinton said, watching Daniel attack his slice of pie with enthusiasm. "Smart as a whip. He deserves better than a rough rancher for a guardian, but I'm doing my best." "You're doing wonderfully," Louise said firmly. "Daniel is well-mannered, kind, and eager to learn. Those qualities come from good guidance." Quinton looked at her with such gratitude that she felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack, just a little. After Daniel finished his pie and began to yawn, Quinton walked Louise back to the boarding house. The evening air was cool and pleasant after the heat of the day, and the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "Thank you for joining us," Quinton said as they reached the boarding house steps. "It meant a great deal to me, to both of us." "I enjoyed it very much," Louise replied, and realized she meant it completely. For the first time in months, she had spent an entire evening without the weight of grief pressing down on her shoulders. "Would you consider allowing me to call on you again?" Quinton asked, his voice careful. "Not out of obligation this time, but because I would very much like to know you better." Louise's heart beat faster. This was dangerous territory. Getting close to someone meant risking pain again. It meant opening herself to the possibility of loss. But as she looked at Quinton's kind face and hopeful eyes, she found she could not say no. "I would like that," she said softly. His smile could have lit up the entire town. Over the following weeks, Quinton became a regular presence in Louise's life. He came to town twice a week now instead of just Saturdays, always with some errand as an excuse, but really just to see her. They took walks together in the cool evening air. They attended church socials together. They sat on the boarding house porch and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Louise found herself opening up to him in ways she had not anticipated. She told him about her love of teaching, about the books that had shaped her thinking, about her dreams of maybe one day writing her own textbooks for children. He listened to everything with that same focused attention that made her feel like she was the most interesting person in the world. Quinton shared his own dreams with her too. He wanted to build his ranch into something that could last for generations. He wanted to improve the breeding lines of his cattle and horses. He wanted to be a good guardian to Daniel and give the boy every opportunity to make something of himself. And underneath it all, she could hear the loneliness that he did not quite voice, the wish for a true family, for a partner to share the work and the dreams and the quiet evenings. October arrived, bringing cooler weather and the first hints of the winter to come. The leaves on the cottonwoods along the Humboldt River turned gold and orange. The mountains acquired a dusting of snow on their highest peaks, and Louise realized with a start that she was falling in love. It terrified her. She had loved Thomas with the uncomplicated devotion of a young bride, but this was different. She was older now, more careful, more aware of how quickly happiness could be snatched away. And there was the other thing, the secret she carried like a stone in her chest, growing heavier every time Quinton mentioned wanting a family or smiled at Daniel with such paternal pride. She could not give him children. She could not give him the family he so clearly wanted. And she was going to have to tell him, even though she knew it would mean the end of whatever was growing between them. Quinton asked her to visit his ranch on a Sunday afternoon in mid-October. He sent a proper wagon with a driver to collect her, along with a note promising to return her to town before dark. Louise accepted the invitation even though her stomach churned with anxiety. Perhaps it would be easier to tell him out there, away from the curious eyes of the town. The Tanner ranch was more impressive than Louise had imagined. The main house was a solid structure of wood and stone, built to withstand the harsh winters and hot summers of the Nevada high desert. Corrals and outbuildings spread out behind it, all well maintained and organized. She could see cattle grazing in distant pastures and horses in the nearer paddocks. It was clear that Quinton was not just a good rancher but a successful one. He greeted her with obvious pleasure, helping her down from the wagon himself and offering his arm to show her around. Daniel ran ahead of them, pointing out his favorite horses and the new calf that had been born just the week before. The boy had lost his shyness entirely around Louise now and chattered happily about ranch life. Quinton's house was comfortable inside, furnished with sturdy furniture and warmed by a large stone fireplace. There were books on shelves, surprising her with their number and variety. She saw volumes of poetry alongside practical works on animal husbandry, novels beside agricultural journals. "My wife was a great reader," Quinton said softly, noticing her interest. "I kept all her books. I've added some of my own over the years, too. I never had much formal schooling, but I've tried to educate myself as best I could." "You've done well," Louise said, running her fingers along the spines. "This is a better library than some wealthy family's own." They had lunch at the long table in his dining room, served by his housekeeper, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, who had emigrated from China with her husband 15 years earlier. Her husband worked as one of Quinton's most trusted ranch hands, and she clearly ran the household with quiet efficiency. After lunch, Quinton suggested a walk. They left Daniel with Mrs. Chen, who promised to let the boy help her bake cookies, and headed out across the ranch land. The day was beautiful, the air crisp and clean, the sky impossibly blue. Mountains rose on all sides of the valley, creating a sense of being cradled by the earth itself. "I love this land," Quinton said as they walked. "My father homesteaded here before the war. He died when I was 17 and I took over the ranch. It was small then, just 100 acres and maybe 50 head of cattle. I've built it up to nearly 2,000 acres now and I run about 500 head. You must be very proud," Louise said. "I am, but it's also lonely." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Louise, I think you must know by now that my feelings for you have grown beyond simple friendship." Her heart hammered in her chest. "Quinton, please let me finish." He took her hands gently in his. "I did not expect to feel this way again. After Mary died, I thought that part of my life was over. But then you came to Unionville and everything changed. You're intelligent and kind and wonderful with children. You make me laugh. You make me think. You make me hope for things I thought I had given up on." Louise felt tears prick her eyes. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you're strong because you've survived loss. I know you're dedicated because of how you've thrown yourself into teaching. I know you're brave because you came here alone to start a new life. And I know that I want to spend the rest of my life learning everything else there is to know about you. Quinton, there's something I have to tell you." Louise pulled her hands from his and wrapped her arms around herself. The words she had been dreading rose in her throat like bitter medicine. "Something you need to know before this goes any further. Whatever it is, we can face it together." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "I was married before. My husband Thomas died 6 months ago. But before that, I was pregnant. Our daughter was stillborn and the complications from the birth were severe." She forced herself to look at him to see the hope die in his eyes. "The doctor said I would never be able to conceive again. I cannot bear children, Quinton. I'm barren." There it was, the ugly truth laid bare between them. She waited for him to step back to make his excuses, to gently explain that he needed someone who could give him a real family. Instead, Quinton's expression softened with compassion. He stepped closer and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "Is that all?" he asked softly. Louise stared at him. "Is that all? Quinton, did you hear what I said? I cannot give you children. You want a family. You deserve a family. You deserve a woman who can give you sons and daughters to inherit this ranch you've worked so hard to build." "I heard every word," Quinton said, his voice steady and sure. "And I'm telling you it doesn't matter." "How can it not matter?" "Because there are children all over this territory who need homes and families. Orphans from the mining camps, children whose parents died of illness or accidents, babies abandoned because their parents couldn't care for them. We could adopt them, Louise. We could give them the family they need while building the family we want." He smiled at her, that beautiful warm smile that transformed his face. "If you're willing to marry me, then we'll adopt a dozen children if that's what you want. We'll fill this house with love and laughter and the sound of children playing. It doesn't matter to me whether they're born to us or whether we choose them and they choose us. All that matters is love." Louise could not speak. She stood there with tears streaming down her face, unable to believe what she was hearing. No man would say such a thing. No man would be so willing to give up the dream of his own children. But Quinton was not finished. He took both her hands again and held them firmly. "Louise, I loved my first wife dearly. She was a good woman and we were happy together. But Mary and I tried for 5 years to have a child and never succeeded. The doctor said it was unlikely to happen. We had even started talking about adopting before she fell ill. So you see, this isn't some noble sacrifice I'm making for you. This is something I had already considered and accepted for my own life. You never said anything. It didn't seem important at first. And then, as I came to care for you more deeply, I wanted you to know me as a person first, not as a man with a particular problem or need. But I'm telling you now, as clearly as I can, that your ability or inability to bear children makes no difference to my feelings for you. I love you, Louise Nichols. I love your strength and your kindness and your brilliant mind. I love the way you care for your students and the way you listen when I talk about my dreams. I love how you've slowly let me see past your grief to the incredible woman underneath. And if you can find it in your heart to love me even a little bit in return, then I promise you we will build a beautiful family together, one way or another." Louise could not hold back the sobs any longer. She collapsed against his chest, and he wrapped his strong arms around her, holding her while she cried out all the fear and shame and grief she had been carrying for so long. He stroked her hair and murmured soft words of comfort, in no hurry to move or speak, just letting her release the poison that had been eating away at her heart. When she finally pulled back, shaking and exhausted but somehow lighter, she looked up at his face and saw nothing but love and patience and absolute sincerity. "I do love you," she whispered. "I fought against it because I was so afraid, but I love you, Quinton Tanner. I love your gentleness and your strength and the way you care for Daniel. I love your dreams and your dedication and the way you make me feel like I might actually be able to be happy again. Then marry me," he said simply. "Marry me and let's build a life together. Let's fill this ranch with children who need us and let's grow old watching them grow up strong and happy. Let's take all the love we have to give and pour it into something beautiful." "Yes," Louise said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." Quinton kissed her then, gentle and sweet and full of promise. And standing there in the Nevada sunshine with the mountains all around them and the future stretching out bright and full of possibility, Louise felt the frozen place in her heart finally begin to thaw. They married 3 weeks later in the small church in Unionville. It was a simple ceremony attended by the whole town, it seemed, with Daniel proudly serving as Quinton's best man and Mr. Thompson giving Louise away since she had no family of her own present. Mrs. Patterson and the other women had decorated the church with fall flowers and ribbons, and the celebration afterwards in the church social hall was warm and genuine. Louise moved to the ranch immediately after the wedding, settling into her new role as Mrs. Tanner with a sense of rightness that surprised her. The house welcomed her, and Mrs. Chen was delighted to have another woman around. Daniel was overjoyed to have Louise living with them permanently, and the three of them quickly established comfortable routines. Louise continued teaching, making the 10-mile journey to town 3 days a week in the wagon with Daniel. Mr. Thompson's health had declined further, and she had taken over most of the teaching duties by necessity. The school board was pleased with her work and grateful that she had no intention of leaving when she married, as most female teachers did. But as happy as Louise was with her new marriage and her teaching, she and Quinton both knew that their family was not yet complete. They wanted children, and they were both eager to begin the process of adoption. The challenge was that formal adoption was not yet a straightforward process in Nevada in 1878. There were no organized agencies, no standardized procedures. Instead, they had to rely on word of mouth, on connections through the church and community, on the informal networks that existed to place children who needed homes. It was Reverend Potter who first told them about a situation that might lead to their first adoption. A young woman in Virginia City, about 50 miles away, was dying of tuberculosis. She had 2 children, boys aged 5 and 3, and no family willing or able to take them when she passed. The woman's greatest fear was that her sons would be separated, sent to different families or different orphanages, growing up apart from each other. Quinton and Louise made the journey to Virginia City immediately. The woman, Sarah Dalton, was indeed very ill, wasted away by the disease but still fiercely concerned about her children. She met with Quinton and Louise in the boarding house where she lived, studying them with eyes that missed nothing despite her weakness. "I need to know they'll be together," Sarah said, her voice raspy. "They're brothers. They need each other, especially after losing their pa and now losing me. Promise me you'll keep them together." "We promise," Louise said, taking the woman's thin hand. "They'll be raised as brothers. They'll never be separated. And you'll tell them about me, about their father, every day," Quinton assured her. "They'll know where they came from and how much you loved them." Sarah searched their faces one more time, then nodded weakly. "Then take them. Take them now before this gets worse. I don't want them to watch me die." The goodbyes were heartbreaking. The older boy, Robert, understood what was happening and clung to his mother with desperate strength. The younger one, William, was confused and frightened, crying for his mama. Sarah held herself together with visible effort, kissing her sons and whispering words of love to them, promising that she would always watch over them from heaven. Louise and Quinton drove the 2 boys back to the ranch that same day, both children crying in the back of the wagon. It was one of the hardest things Louise had ever done, taking these children from their dying mother, even though she knew it was necessary and right. She sat in the back with them, holding them both and letting them cry against her, murmuring soft reassurances that she knew could not possibly help much right now but might help later. At the ranch, Mrs. Chen had prepared 2 small beds in one of the extra rooms, and she welcomed the boys with gentle pragmatism, offering them cookies and milk and showing them the barn kittens. Daniel, suddenly a big brother figure, took the boys under his wing with surprising maturity for a 10-year-old, showing them around and promising to teach them how to ride. Those first weeks were difficult. Robert was angry and grieving, prone to tantrums and tears. William woke up every night crying for his mother. Both boys were convinced that Louise and Quinton would send them away or split them up despite all the promises to the contrary. It took patience and consistency, and so much love to slowly convince them that this was their home now, that they were wanted and safe, and would never be separated. Louise drew on her teaching experience, understanding that grief was not something to be rushed through, but rather something to be acknowledged and held. She let the boys talk about their mother whenever they wanted. She helped them make a memory box with the few items Sarah had sent with them. A photograph, a hair ribbon, a letter she had written to each of them to be read when they were older. Quinton showed his love through steady presence and gentle guidance. He taught the boys to feed the chickens and helped them learn to ride the gentlest horses. He read to them every evening before bed, his deep voice a comfort in the darkness. He never tried to replace their father, but instead offered them a new kind of paternal love, one that acknowledged their loss while promising them security. Word came 3 weeks after the boys arrived that Sarah Dalton had passed peacefully in her sleep. Louise and Quinton told Robert and William together, holding them as they cried, helping them understand that while their mother was gone, her love for them remained, and their new family would honor her memory forever. Slowly, painfully, the boys began to heal. Robert's tantrums became less frequent. William started sleeping through the night more often. Both began to laugh again, to play again, to act like the children they were supposed to be. And one evening, about 2 months after they arrived, Robert climbed into Louise's lap and called her Mama for the first time. She cried, holding him close, and felt her heart expand to hold this child who was not born to her but was absolutely, completely hers. The formal legal adoption took several more months to complete, requiring trips to the courthouse in Winnemucca and testimony from community members vouching for Quinton and Louise's character and ability to care for the children. But finally, in the spring of 1879, the judge signed the papers making Robert and William Tanner legal members of the family, but their family was not finished growing. That summer, a fire in one of the mining camps near Austin left several families homeless and destitute. Among the survivors was a girl of 7 named Charlotte, whose parents had both died in the fire. She had been staying with various families in the camp, passed from one to another like an unwanted burden, growing quieter and more withdrawn with each transfer. Louise heard about Charlotte from one of her former students, whose family had briefly housed the girl. The moment she heard about a grieving child with no permanent home, Louise knew what needed to happen. Charlotte arrived at the ranch on a hot August day, a tiny thing with enormous brown eyes and hair that had been hacked short and uneven by someone who clearly had no idea how to care for a little girl. She did not cry or cling like the boys had. Instead, she was eerily silent, accepting whatever happened with a passivity that broke Louise's heart. "It's all right," Louise told her gently, kneeling down to the girl's level. "You're safe here. You can stay with us for as long as you need." Charlotte just stared at her with those huge, haunted eyes. It took weeks before Charlotte spoke more than a word or two at a time. She moved through the house like a ghost, doing whatever she was told but initiating nothing, showing no preference or desire or personality. Louise was patient, including Charlotte in daily activities without forcing participation, providing opportunities for connection without demanding them. The breakthrough came through Robert and William. The boys, secure now in their own place in the family, adopted Charlotte as their sister immediately and refused to let her retreat completely into herself. They insisted she play with them. They brought her flowers and interesting rocks. They told her silly jokes until she finally, grudgingly, smiled. And then one day Charlotte saw a bird with a broken wing in the yard. She ran to Louise, the first time she had initiated any interaction, and begged with tears in her eyes for them to help it. Together, they made a small cage and nursed the bird back to health over several weeks. Charlotte checked on it constantly, talking to it in soft whispers, and when they finally released it and watched it fly away, Charlotte threw her arms around Louise and cried for the first time since arriving. After that, Charlotte slowly came back to life. Her personality emerged, stubborn and creative and fiercely loyal. She followed Louise everywhere, soaking up attention and affection like a plant that had been too long without water. And when her adoption was finalized the following spring, she insisted on a party to celebrate, helping Louise bake a cake and picking flowers to decorate the table. The ranch that had once been too quiet and empty now rang with children's voices. Robert, William, and Charlotte became inseparable, along with Daniel, who had fully embraced his role as oldest sibling. The house felt alive in a way it never had before, full of laughter and arguments and the organized chaos of family life. Louise and Quinton would stand on the porch in the evening sometimes, watching the children play in the yard, and marvel at how their life had unfolded. They had built their family not through biology, but through choice and love and commitment, and it was more beautiful than either of them had imagined. But they were not done yet. In the fall of 1880, a wagon train passing through the area was struck by early winter storms in the mountains. Several people died, including a young couple with a newborn baby boy. The baby somehow survived, kept warm by his dead mother's body until rescuers found him 2 days later. The child was brought to Unionville, and the doctor asked if Louise and Quinton would consider taking him, knowing their commitment to adoption and their capacity to care for children who needed homes. They agreed immediately, despite the fact that caring for an infant would be challenging alongside their other responsibilities. Baby Michael was perhaps 6 weeks old, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that proved he had survived his ordeal intact. Louise fell in love with him instantly, that deep maternal love that she had thought she would never experience. She held him close and wept with gratitude that she had been given this chance to mother an infant after all. The older children were fascinated by the baby. Charlotte appointed herself his special guardian, always wanting to help feed him or rock him. Robert and William were more cautious but clearly proud to have a baby brother. Daniel, now 13 and increasingly interested in ranch work, nevertheless made time every evening to play with Michael and make him laugh. Quinton was a natural with the baby, surprising Louise with his gentle competence. He would walk the floor with Michael during colicky nights, singing old songs in his deep voice. He changed diapers without complaint and learned to warm bottles to exactly the right temperature. And the look on his face when Michael smiled at him for the first time was one of pure joy. Michael's adoption was expedited due to his circumstances, and he legally became a Tanner by Christmas of that year. Louise made sure to document everything about his origin, wanting him to know his story when he was old enough. How his parents had died trying to make a better life in California, how he had survived against all odds, how he had been welcomed into a family who loved him completely. The years that followed were full and busy. The children grew and thrived. Robert proved to have a gift for working with animals and spent hours helping Quinton train horses. William was mechanically inclined and loved helping the ranch hands repair equipment. Charlotte showed artistic talent, constantly drawing and painting, and Louise encouraged her by ordering art supplies from San Francisco. Daniel prepared to take over more responsibility on the ranch, showing the same quiet competence as his uncle. And Michael grew from a solemn infant into a cheerful toddler who followed everyone around and got into everything. Louise continued teaching part-time, though she had to reduce her hours as the children required more attention at home. Mr. Thompson eventually had to retire completely due to his health, and the school board hired a young man from Carson City to take over the older students. Louise focused on the youngest children, teaching morning classes and spending afternoons with her own growing family. Quinton expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land as it became available and improving his herds. The ranch became known throughout the territory for quality cattle and well-trained horses. He took pride in teaching his children the business, wanting all of them to understand ranching whether they chose that life or not. Their family reputation for welcoming children who needed homes became well known. The local churches and civic leaders began referring orphaned or abandoned children to them regularly. Louise and Quinton were selective, knowing they had limits on what they could reasonably handle, but over the next several years, they added 3 more children to their family. First came twin girls, Emma and Elizabeth, who were 5 years old when their alcoholic father abandoned them at a saloon in town. The bartender found them huddled in a corner, hungry and filthy, and brought them to Quinton, knowing he would help. The twins were wary at first, having learned that adults could not be trusted, but they blossomed under consistent love and care. Then came an older boy, 14-year-old Thomas, whose mother had died and whose stepfather wanted nothing to do with him. Thomas was nearly grown, angry and hurt, convinced he was too old to be wanted. Quinton saw something of himself in the boy and insisted they give him a chance. It was difficult at first. Thomas tested boundaries constantly and got into fights with the other boys. But Quinton's patient firmness and Louise's unwavering belief in him slowly transformed Thomas into a responsible young man who became another set of capable hands on the ranch. Finally came little Anna, who was just 3 years old when they adopted her. She had been living in terrible conditions with distant relatives, who saw her as an inconvenience. She was malnourished and delayed in her development, but under Louise's devoted care and the attention of her many siblings, Anna caught up quickly and revealed herself to be a bright, affectionate child. By 1885, the Tanner household consisted of Quinton and Louise, Daniel, who was now 18, Robert and William, who were 12 and 10, Charlotte, who was 14, Michael, who was 5, the twins Emma and Elizabeth, who were 10, Thomas, who was 19, and little Anna, who was 8. 10 children in all, though Daniel and Thomas were nearly grown and taking on more adult roles on the ranch. The house had been expanded twice to accommodate everyone, with additional bedrooms and a larger kitchen and dining room. Meals were noisy, chaotic affairs with everyone talking over each other and vying for attention. Evenings were spent with homework and reading, and the hundreds of small tasks required to keep such a large household running. Sundays meant church followed by a big family dinner and time for rest and play. It was exhausting and challenging and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also deeply, profoundly fulfilling. Louise would look around the dinner table at all the faces she loved and feel such gratitude that she could hardly breathe. These children, each with their own story of loss and pain, had become a family. They belonged to each other now, bound not by blood but by choice and love and shared experience. Quinton would catch her eye across the table sometimes and smile, and she knew he felt the same overwhelming joy and gratitude. They had built this together, this beautiful, chaotic, loving family. They had taken their own pain and transformed it into something good and healing, not just for themselves but for all these children who had needed a home. But life was not without its challenges. Thomas struggled with his anger for years before finally finding peace. Charlotte had nightmares about the fire well into her teenage years. The twins developed their own language and refused to speak English for an entire year, requiring patience and creativity to integrate them fully into the family. Michael went through a phase of trying to run away, convinced that his birth parents would somehow come back for him if he could just find the place where they died. Anna's early neglect left her with health problems that required regular medical attention. Through it all, Quinton and Louise held firm. They provided structure and love and consistency. They acknowledged each child's pain while insisting on hope for the future. They treated all the children equally, never playing favorites, never comparing them to each other. They celebrated each child's unique gifts and helped them overcome their individual challenges. Louise often thought about that terrible day when the doctor had told her she would never bear children. At the time, it had felt like the end of her life, the death of all her dreams for the future. But standing in her kitchen surrounded by the sound of her children, or watching them play in the yard, or tucking them into bed at night, she realized that this was so much better than anything she had originally imagined. She had not given birth to these children, but she was absolutely their mother. She had not carried them in her womb, but she carried them in her heart. And the love she felt for them was no different than if they had been born to her, fierce and protective and unconditional. Quinton felt the same way. He was father to all these children in every way that mattered. He provided for them, protected them, guided them, loved them with everything he had. The ranch that he had once built for himself and some future biological heir was now being built for all of them. A legacy of land and livestock and love that would pass down through generations. As the children grew older, they began to understand more fully what their adoptions meant. They knew they had been chosen, wanted, specifically picked out to be part of this family. Instead of feeling like a lesser status than being born into a family, it felt special. They were Tanners by choice and love, and that meant something profound. Some of the children chose to find out more about their birth families when they were old enough. Robert and William visited their mother's grave in Virginia City and left flowers, thanking her for loving them enough to find them a good home. Charlotte researched the fire that killed her parents and found distant cousins who were able to tell her stories about her family. Michael never wanted to know more than the basic facts, saying that his life started the day Louise and Quinton took him in, and everything before that was just prologue. Daniel, who was not technically adopted since he had come to Quinton as family, always insisted that he was just as much a chosen child as the others. "Uncle Quinton didn't have to take me in," he would say. "He could have sent me to other relatives. But he chose to make me his son, and that makes me adopted in all the ways that matter." The ranch prospered along with the family. Quinton's reputation for quality stock and fair dealing spread throughout the territory and into California and Oregon. He was able to hire more hands and expand further. The children all contributed to the work as they grew older, learning responsibility and the satisfaction of a job well done. Louise eventually stopped teaching at the school in town, finding that managing such a large household and homeschooling the younger children required all her time. She did not regret the change. Her true calling had turned out to be motherhood, and she threw herself into it with the same dedication she had given to teaching. But the greatest joy came from watching the children form bonds with each other that transcended their different origins. They were fiercely loyal siblings, defending each other against anyone who dared to mock them for being adopted or suggest they were not a real family. They played together, fought together, supported each other through challenges, and celebrated each other's successes. Robert and William remained as close as brothers could be, just as their birth mother had hoped. Charlotte became the organizer and planner, keeping everyone on schedule and mediating disputes. Daniel and Thomas worked closely on the ranch, becoming true friends despite their different personalities. The twins developed into individuals while maintaining their special connection. Michael and Anna, the youngest, had each other, and also the devoted attention of all their older siblings. Years passed in the comfortable rhythm of ranch life. Daniel married a girl from town and built a house on the ranch property, staying on to help run the operation. Thomas eventually left to join the cavalry, writing frequent letters home and visiting whenever he could. Robert apprenticed with a veterinarian and became the area's expert on animal medicine. William found work as a mechanic on the new railroad and moved to Reno, but came home regularly. Charlotte married a teacher and moved to Carson City, but corresponded constantly with Louise, the two of them maintaining a close mother-daughter bond through letters. The twins both became nurses, determined to help people after watching their adopted mother care for so many. Michael took over more responsibility on the ranch, showing the same talent for the work as Quinton. Anna became a talented seamstress and opened a shop in Unionville. Through all the changes and milestones, the family remained close. Holiday gatherings brought everyone home to the ranch, filling the house with the next generation of children. Louise and Quinton became grandparents many times over, welcoming grandchildren with the same open hearts they had shown their own children. The townspeople of Unionville watched the Tanner family grow and thrive over the years, and the general opinion was that Quinton and Louise had built something remarkable. They had proven that family was about far more than blood, that love could create bonds just as strong as any biological connection. Louise sometimes thought about her first husband and their lost daughter, but the grief had transformed into something gentle and bittersweet rather than sharp and painful. She believed that Thomas would have been happy to see the life she had built, the family she had created. And she liked to imagine her stillborn daughter watching from heaven with approval, glad that her mother had found a way to be a mother after all. Quinton's first wife, Mary, would have approved too, Louise thought. Mary had wanted to adopt, had understood that there were many ways to build a family. She would have loved these children and been proud of what Quinton and Louise had accomplished together. On their 15th wedding anniversary in 1893, Quinton and Louise sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. The house behind them was full of visiting children and grandchildren, the sound of laughter and conversation drifting out through the open windows. "You ever regret it?" Quinton asked, taking her hand. "The hard work, the challenges, the sheer chaos of raising so many children." Louise squeezed his hand, looking at the life they had built spread out before them. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This has been better than any dream I ever had. Every challenge was worth it. Every difficult moment led to something beautiful. We did good, didn't we?" Quinton's voice held satisfaction and pride. "We did good," Louise agreed. "We took our pain and our loss and we transformed it into something healing and good. We gave children homes and love and futures. We built a family that will last for generations." "I love you," Quinton said, just as simply and honestly as he had said it that first day when she had confessed her inability to have children. "I love you too," Louise replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for seeing past what I couldn't give you to what we could build together." "Thank you for saying yes," Quinton said. "For taking a chance on a lonely rancher and his dreams of a house full of children." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, and the stars emerged, listening to the sounds of their family inside. 3-year-old granddaughter Sarah ran out onto the porch, pursued by her older brother, both of them shrieking with laughter. Louise caught Sarah up in her arms, and the little girl snuggled close, thumb in her mouth. "Tell us a story, Grandma," Sarah demanded around her thumb. "What kind of story?" Louise asked, though she already knew. "Tell about when you and Grandpa started adopting all the children," Sarah said. It was everyone's favorite story, the tale of how the family had been built. Louise looked at Quinton and smiled. "Well," she began, "it started when I was very sad because I thought I could never have children. But then I met your grandpa, and he was very wise. He said that there were many children who needed homes and families, and that we could build our family by choosing children and having them choose us back." Sarah listened with wide eyes, even though she had heard the story many times before. Other grandchildren began to gather, drawn by the sound of story time. Even some of the adult children drifted out onto the porch, smiling as they listened to their mother tell the story of how their family was formed. Louise told about adopting Robert and William, about Charlotte and Michael, about the twins and Thomas and Anna. She told about the challenges and the joys, about the hard times and the good times. She told about learning that love was not limited, that hearts could expand to hold as many people as needed holding. And as she talked, surrounded by the children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren who had resulted from those long-ago decisions, Louise felt profound gratitude for the path her life had taken. The inability to bear children that had once seemed like a curse had turned out to be a blessing in disguise, leading her to build a family far larger and more diverse than she ever could have created through birth alone. When the story ended, the children scattered back inside, and Louise and Quinton were left alone again in the peaceful darkness. The ranch stretched out around them, the land they had worked so hard to build and preserve. But the real legacy was not the land or the livestock or the buildings. The real legacy was the family they had created, the children they had saved, the love they had multiplied exponentially through their willingness to open their home and hearts. Years continued to pass. Quinton and Louise grew older, their hair turning white, their steps slowing. But they remained active on the ranch with Michael's help, and their door remained always open to family. They became great-grandparents and then great-great-grandparents, their descendants spreading out across the West, but always maintaining their connection to the ranch that was the family's heart. When Louise was 70 years old, the town of Unionville honored her and Quinton with a special ceremony, recognizing them for their decades of providing homes to orphan children. Over 30 children had found families through their direct efforts, and their example had inspired other families in the area to consider adoption as well. The impact they had made on the community was immeasurable. Louise stood before the gathered crowd in the church social hall, looking at the faces of her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had come to support her. She thought about the frightened, grieving young widow who had stepped off the stagecoach in this very town so many years ago, convinced that her life was over and that she had nothing left to offer the world. "I want to thank you all for this honor," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "But the truth is that Quinton and I were not doing anything extraordinary. We were simply loving children who needed love. We were opening our home to those who had no home. And in doing so, we received far more than we gave. Every child we adopted made our lives richer and fuller. They taught us about resilience and courage and the incredible strength of the human spirit. They showed us that family is not about biology but about commitment and choice and unconditional love." She looked at Quinton, standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder. He was 82 now, still tall but stooped with age, his face deeply lined but his eyes still kind and sharp. "My husband once told me that if I could not bear children, we would adopt a dozen," Louise continued. "He kept that promise and then some. Together, we built a family that has brought more joy than either of us could have imagined. And the greatest gift of all is knowing that this family will continue long after we are gone, that the love we planted will keep growing and spreading and blessing future generations." The applause was thunderous, and Louise saw more than a few people wiping tears from their eyes. She stepped down from the podium and was immediately surrounded by her family, all of them wanting to hug her and tell her they loved her. That night, back at the ranch, Louise and Quinton sat in their bedroom looking at the family Bible where all the names were recorded. There were the children they had adopted, the spouses those children had married, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had come after. Each name represented a life, a story, a soul that was part of their family tree. "We built something good," Quinton said softly, running his finger down the long list of names. "We built something beautiful," Louise corrected, taking his hand. "And it will last long after we're dust." Quinton smiled at her, the same warm smile that had won her heart all those years ago. "I would not change a single thing," he said. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, it was all exactly as it should have been." "Neither would I," Louise agreed, leaning against his shoulder just as she had done so many times over their long marriage. "You saved my life, you know. When I came here, I was drowning in grief and shame. I thought I had nothing left to offer. But you saw me differently. You saw possibility where I saw only loss." "You saved mine too," Quinton said, kissing the top of her head. "I was lonely and going through the motions of living without really being alive. You brought joy and purpose and love back into my life. Together, we saved each other, and then we saved all those children." They sat quietly, holding hands, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch at night. The wind in the cottonwoods, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the old house settling. These were the sounds that had formed the backdrop of their life together, and they were as comforting as a favorite song. Louise lived to see her 75th birthday, surrounded by 4 generations of family who had gathered to celebrate. It was a beautiful autumn day, much like the day Quinton had proposed to her all those years ago. She sat in a chair of honor on the porch, greeting each family member with love and making sure to spend time with everyone, especially the youngest great-great-grandchildren who would carry the family into the future. That evening, as the sun set and the party wound down, Louise asked Quinton to take her for a walk. They moved slowly now, both dependent on canes, but they made their way out to the spot where Quinton had first told her he loved her, and that her inability to have children did not matter. "This is where you changed my life," Louise said, looking at the mountains painted gold by the setting sun. "This is where you took my deepest shame and transformed it into hope." "This is where our real life began," Quinton agreed, his arm around her shoulders. They stood together as the light faded, 2 old people who had loved each other well and built something that would outlast them both. And when Louise passed peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks later, she died knowing that her life had been full and meaningful and rich beyond measure. Quinton followed her 6 months later, as if he could not bear to be without her for long. They were buried side by side in the cemetery overlooking Unionville, their graves marked with a simple stone that read, "Quinton and Louise Tanner. They built their family with love and left a legacy of hope." But their true legacy was not in the stone or the words carved on it. Their legacy was in the dozens of descendants who gathered for their funerals, in the stories that were told and retold about the couple who had proven that family was about choice and love rather than biology. Their legacy was in the children who had been saved from loneliness and neglect, who had grown into strong and capable adults who passed on the lessons they had learned about resilience and compassion. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through Michael and his children, each generation adding to it and improving it while maintaining the core values that Quinton and Louise had established. The house was preserved as much as possible, kept as a gathering place for family reunions and a reminder of where they had all come from. And sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the sun painted the mountains gold and the air smelled of coming winter, family members would stand in that spot where Quinton had proposed and Louise had confessed her inability to bear children. They would remember the conversation that had taken place there, the moment when two broken people had found healing in each other and decided to build something beautiful from their pain. "Then we will adopt a dozen," Quinton had said, and he had kept his promise. Together, he and Louise had created a family that proved love was stronger than biology. That commitment was more powerful than bloodlines. That opening your heart to those who needed love was the greatest adventure of all. Their story became a part of family lore, told and retold to each new generation. It became a reminder that the things we think are our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths, that loss can transform into gain, that the end of one dream can be the beginning of something even better. The children they had adopted grew old themselves, and they told their own children and grandchildren about the day they had arrived at the ranch, frightened and grieving and certain they would never belong anywhere again. They told about how Louise and Quinton had welcomed them with open arms and patient love, how they had been given not just a house but a home, not just guardians but parents, not just a place to stay but a family to belong to forever. And the message was always the same. Love is a choice, family is built through commitment, and opening your heart to those who need it is never a sacrifice, but rather a blessing that multiplies beyond measure. Decades after Quinton and Louise had passed, their great-great-great-grandchildren still gathered at the ranch for reunions. They still told the stories. They still marveled at the courage it had taken for two people to look at traditional expectations and choose a different path. They still felt connected to ancestors they had never met but whose influence had shaped every generation that came after. The town of Unionville changed over the years. The silver mines played out and were abandoned. The population declined. But the Tanner Ranch remained, a constant presence in the valley, a reminder of what could be built through hard work and love and determination. And if you had been there on certain autumn evenings, standing in just the right spot as the sun set behind the mountains, you might have almost heard the echo of a conversation from long ago. A confession of inability, a declaration of love, a promise to build a family through adoption, and the beginning of a legacy that would last forever. A gentle rancher and a grieving widow who had found each other against all odds, and proven that sometimes the families we choose are even stronger than the ones we are born into, that love knows no limits, and that the greatest adventures often begin with the courage to see possibility where others see only obstacles.